Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Curators conversation for 1.5 degrees Celsius. My name is Caroline White, and I'm the Education and Learning Manager for MSU Museum's CoLab Studio and your moderator for this discussion. As a bit of background, 1.5 degrees Celsius examines the gravest challenges of the near and distant future involving climate, ecosystems, and people associated with global temperature increase. It will be on display at the MSU Museum from September 6, 2022 to February 25th, 2023. So today I'm joined by a few of the members of the curatorial team for this exhibition, Abhishek, Hadley, Julie, and Mark. So to begin, I will let each of them briefly tell us a bit about themselves. And Abhishek, we'll start with you.
Sure. My name is Abhishek Narula, an assistant professor in electronic art and intermedia here at MSU. In my own creative practice, I build interactive installations, and my subject matter sort of ranges from surveillance, technology, to ecology, and climate science.
Thank you. Hadley, you want to go next?
Yep. I'm Hadley. I'm a recent graduate of MSU where I studied art history and chemical engineering. And then regarding the MSU Museum CoLab Studio, I was a collaborator for the past 5 seasons since the first show came to Detroit.
And then Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Labarkin. I'm a professor in Earth and Environmental Science. I'm a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and the Associate Dean for STEM Education, Research, and Innovation. Because I'm in the Earth and Environmental Sciences, climate change really does impact everything that we do.
And then Mark.
My name is Mark Sullivan. I'm the creative director for the MSU Museum CoLab Studio, and I've been with the predecessor of that project for about 5 years. I am a faculty member at Michigan State University. I teach in the College of Music, but I also have taught photography in the residential college and have an online course in photography, and I'm active as a professional composer and photographer. And as an educator, I've worked quite a bit with young people creating various kinds of media composition. Some of them are sometimes called multimedia, sometimes intermedia, and no matter what kind of media is always part of the combination, and that's just fine.
Excellent. Thank you all. So to really start our first question, we'll maybe start with you, Mark, and then others can certainly add on as well. But how did you come up for the concept for this exhibition, and why did MSU Museum's CoLab Studio want to explore climate change?
So I think one of the primary motivators for choosing this subject had to do with a number of discussions among various people, which led to the point where we felt that of all the wicked problems facing society and universities and our communities, this one in a way took precedence, partly because if it doesn't get addressed and doesn't get the attention needed to create the change that could forestall some of the catastrophes that could happen, none of the other problems will be solved. So even personally, I felt that I've been aware of various issues for quite a long time, but I felt that I needed to put some things on the back burner so that I could address this, because it's becoming acutely important to solve. I have 2 children under the age of 35, and that just brings home even more clearly how important this issue is, and it's complex. And in most of our discussions, we reached an interesting point, which is where we focused on 2 things. One was, what can we do, which is complex and difficult to answer. But another problem emerged that was equally important, which was, how can we get enough people to do what we can do? And that problem is almost as difficult, if not more difficult than the first one. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of what led to this. And there definitely was a desire to explore human agency, what we can do, and to respond to the urgency, but not to paralyze people or scare them to death. We did feel that there's still things that could be done, and we didn't want to just panic everybody.
And can you talk a little, Mark, too, about the significance of the name for the exhibition? So where does 1.5 Celsius come from?
Yeah, might be helpful actually to read a little bit from the curatorial statement, since it addresses that right in the beginning. Goes like this: we are 0.4 degrees Celsius away from catastrophe. In 2015, the Paris Agreement outlined the need to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, if you prefer, above industrial levels. This goal aims to avoid irreparable damage to our climate, our ecosystems, and our ability to inhabit the planet. Failure to do so may cause disastrous calamities, including extreme weather events that impact everything from our ability to grow food to accessing fresh water. Currently, the global temperature increase sits at 1.1 degrees Celsius. Therefore, we must urgently consider the actions we need to take individually and collectively before it's too late. In this exhibition, we will be inviting the public to examine the scope of our impact on the planet and the ways that our lives are deeply interconnected with the well-being of the environment. We hope that the public that comes will start to imagine new ways of addressing the social and environmental issues connected to climate change and how we can build brighter, more sustainable futures. So I think actually that gets at the heart of that title. We thought that the title, which comes from that Paris Agreement, was more than just a newspaper story and more than just another scientific finding. We thought it kind of, in a nutshell, encapsulated the moment that we all find ourselves in.
Thank you for that overview, Mark. It's really helpful. So for Julie, Abhishek, and Hadley too, I want to ask you a little bit about what about this theme really resonated with you, and what are some of the ways that climate change impacts your work and discipline? And Julie, I'm going to start with you, and I know that's a tremendous question to answer for your particular field. So you want to go first?
Yeah, that is a huge question. So it's interesting. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I took a course on global change. And so this was 25 years ago, 25 years. And climate change, while many scientists were talking about it, it was actually not something that was taught within even the earth sciences discipline. It was not a common concept, right? And now my son's 17 and it's across the curriculum. So, he's had it. He says the world is doomed, which, is an important thing to think about. So to your question, how does it resonate and how does it impact my discipline? I would argue that climate change impacts every discipline. So there is no person, there is no community that can't escape climate change. I will say, from an ecological perspective, and I'm really interested in what Abhishek might say, but from an ecological perspective, for any change, there are groups and individuals or communities that benefit from the change, and there are groups and individuals and communities that get the raw end of the stick. When I think about it from a geological history perspective, the climate has changed, of course. Humans live in this climate. And our agriculture, our economy, where we live on continents on this planet, all work because the climate is the way it is. And the thing about climate change is that we can easily predict that our coastlines will change shape, where things can grow will absolutely change, where fresh water is and is not accessible will change, the fertility of soils, and on and on and on, food from the seas, etc. Natural disasters. I could go on about what I would consider earth and environmental constructs. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes that we as scientists make is I think I'm not an artist, so this was a fun exhibit to work on, and I will talk about that later. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that any individual can make is to think that climate change isn't part of who they are, what they do, or how they live. Okay, so it's deeply embedded in my work. And I do want to say one last thing. The thing that resonated with me is while most sciences are predictive, so you have a phenomenon and you predict what will happen, you run an experiment, the earth environmental sciences are retrodictive. So we have a current condition and we try to figure out what was the process that led to that condition. So once we can figure that out, then we can actually start to make predictions about future change. And so what resonated with me is that some of the exhibits in this exhibition are about thinking about the past, and some of them about thinking about the future. So that past to present to future link was really exciting for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I agree. I think like the interesting mix, which we'll talk about later as well, of what we ended up with is really compelling. Abhishek, do you want to go next? And
Sure.
what were some of the things that resonated with you?
Yeah, so I work in art and design, and that has been sort of my career. And so I think what I love, well, little rewind. So I think art and design should address contemporary issues. I think it's a and art has actually always done that. If you look back in history, it has always associated, engaged with the issues most pertinent of those times. And it can be both celebration, but also critique. And I think climate science and climate change in particular, I think is very much an important issue from an art and design perspective. And for me, I love this mix of art and science coming together, kind of what Julie was sort of hinting a little bit, where, I think there's sort of different perspectives on approaching an issue. Buckminster Fuller, for example, talked about the Earth as a giant spaceship, and we know about climate change. We know about these numbers. This report is 2015, and of course, all this stuff has been studied, and people have been talking about it for a long time. But if for some reason we find as human beings unable to sort of come to grasp with these ideas, we are so small, the Earth is so big, and then everything in the middle. And I think art and design in that sense it could be a useful tool in helping us to sort of contend with these issues, both to make sense of where we are, where we're going, what it could be. And I think one thing that maybe makes art a little bit different from science, that it gives you the freedom to speculate, so we're not sort of beholden to predict things how exactly they would be, but to come up with stories and narratives, and allows us to imagine, what could be both good and wrong. And so for me, this exhibition, this whole process has been very exciting, especially these two disciplines that somehow, have always they seem at odds, but if you really dig into it, they can be complementary and helping each other. So
Thank you. Very well said. Hadley, you want to talk a little bit about what resonated with you, particularly, working as a collaborator, you were continuously in that exhibition space, and now you're kind of on the other side behind the scenes thing. So tell us a little bit about how the theme resonated with you.
Yeah, well, going back to kind of what Julie said, was with her 17-year-old son, like I grew up hearing about climate change, and it's been increasingly kind of like doom and gloom. Like it feels like there's very little chance of having a future that is like what my parents had or what my grandparents had. and that things are just going to drastically be incredibly different and probably incredibly hard for us in the coming years. And I think that's something that a lot of my peers feel as well. So when going into this exhibition and hearing about like what the artist submitted, it was this very cool thought that like innovation and like what Abhishek said, like this kind of collaboration between science and art will probably bring the answers that we need for climate change. Like we won't be able to do this alone. We have to be collaborative and work together in order to help create a future that is actually livable. And I hope that being able to see a lot of the pieces in the exhibition, and especially interact with them and create conversations around them, will bring members, especially younger people who come in, this kind of hope that we can all work together to build that future.
I love that. And it goes back to, I think, what Julie and Abhishek and you, Hadley, all said too, about like this always affects every single discipline, like in every single person. And I like that the way this exhibition came together and some of the works in the show really bring that kind of collaboration to the forefront. So the next question I have for, Mark, you want to add on?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you, since you were a member of the curatorial team, how you would answer this question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of what Hadley said resonates pretty deeply with me as well. I think sometimes climate change can feel really intangible, or for a long time it could feel really intangible, of like we've got time to fix this. We can work towards kind of a brighter future too. And now I think things, depending on the narrative, like you see that urgency and you see time essentially kind of running out or running down. And so I think having those conversations that are a little bit more focused on the future too, in addition to acknowledging the urgency, right, are really critical for conversations with our students. For I am in my late 20s, early 30s, so it's very kind of tangible heading in my direction as well, like within our lifetimes, that we'll all feel these impacts. And so I like that it highlights kind of both the urgency of the issue, but also that there's hope for the future too, because I think if we lose hope, then what else is there?
Cool.
All right. So talking a little bit actually about the open call process, because it's a collaboratively designed exhibition. None of us do it alone. Let's talk a little bit about the process for the open call and what were some of the qualities you all were looking for as we reviewed the works. And maybe Mark, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think some people may not even be familiar with the term open call, and even people who are may not be familiar with the way we use it, since we actually send out a statement to all kinds of groups. So we don't just seek out scientists, and we don't just seek out artists, and we don't seek out academics. We actually try to get as broad a spread across many different disciplines, ways of life, communities. It goes out globally. And the statement is intended to bring in proposals that we hope will address the subject in a particular way. So in our discussions prior to creating the open call, we knew that we didn't want, like, as Hadley said, everything to be doom and gloom. We wanted some sense of hope, but we didn't want a false hope. And then sort of to some of the things that Abhishek and Julie were talking about, we also wanted to address sort of unique perspectives. So like we wanted some things that were oral, not just visual work. And we wanted some things that, as Julie mentioned, were future oriented and things that looked at the past. And so the open call is actually a kind of a huge magnet to draw proposals, and it did. And so we got about 100, upwards of 150 proposals and probably a third of those were from all around the world. And they were also, some of them are from individuals, some of them are from teams. There are people working with universities and people working outside of universities, and young people, older people. It's a really broad, diverse field that was submitted, and actually that made things kind of tough because there were so many wonderful ideas. And I was actually struck by the incredible differences in the field. And I wish we could have done 100 pieces, because we could have easily presented 100 really compelling works. It wasn't that we didn't have more, but it's just the dynamics of presenting things in public exhibitions gravitate against that. But it was really a rich, deep, thoughtful, thought-provoking pool of submissions. And okay, so I think that that's sort of the context of the open call. And the curatorial team, their task was to get it down. Initially, I think we cut back to 40, and then we had to keep going, and the goal was to get to 15. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but for me, it was excruciating, because there were a lot of pieces that I didn't want to eliminate, and I knew I couldn't keep all the ones that I wanted, plus other people wanted different things. So the process is truly collaborative, and we did have conversations among ourselves about, were there redundancies? Were there pieces that address the same theme? Was there enough variety of media? You know, did we have any pieces that focused on, you know, oral or smell and so forth? And I think that we achieved a pretty broad range of sensory experience, which to me is like another thing that art can bring to this, is its ability to present things in a sensory way, and using different senses and appealing to different senses. And then the science also can explain some of that in ways that artists can't. So I think there's kind of a double dimensionality to the connection between art and science. It has to do with not only the nature of what's being reflected on, but how, the kind of explanation and explanatory frameworks brought to it. And that's kind of my take on the process. But I, you know, welcome other perspectives from other members of the team.
Hadley, what was kind of the open call process review like for you too, having been kind of working in the gallery space for a number of years? Like, what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was really cool to be able to get to see and actually do like part of the behind the scenes work and see all these artists submitting different ideas, or scientists too, submitting different ideas. And kind of, I feel like the question that I was always coming back to when I was looking through the submissions was like, how would I create a conversation around this? And what questions do you think people would ask? And how would people react to this? And it was really cool to see, like, I don't know, once all the pieces were difficultly narrowed down to just 16 or 14, that like this exhibition coming alive. And I don't know, just exciting to see that all these conversations that will happen around it. Yeah.
That was a really important, valuable perspective too, that you really brought to that conversation as well. Abhishek, what about you?
Yeah, I absolutely loved it, minus the narrowing down. As an artist myself, I'm just, it's like opening someone's studio and seeing, how they work and what they're thinking about. And so reading all the artist statements, looking at the artist's website, to me, that's probably the most fun part of it. And kind of, like just the diversity of angles of how someone can approach this idea of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that just different perspectives. I think that's also very important for this topic, because the science is there, but then, yeah, what do we do about it? And in some ways, we've talked about it requires collaboration, and it requires from hearing from people that haven't been invited to the table before. And so I felt like the same thing was happening in the curation process. And one thing, I want to just kind of stress again what Mark said about the caliber of these applicants. They're not all academics, they are not all scientists and artists, and I think that's what's important, is that even though this is an exhibition, in some ways it's an art exhibition, it's a science exhibition, but the conversation that happens between the pieces that's what's interesting and intriguing. So it's not just about presenting data in a good data visualization, it's not just about feeling in a certain way, but it's about that collectively coming together. And so for me, just the diversity of the applicants and going through that was very enjoyable.
Thank you. Julie, what about you?
So this process was wildly outside of my normal sandbox. I like playing in lots of different sandboxes, but this was definitely outside of my experiences. It was fortuitous because in my role as associate dean, part of our remit is art science interactions in the new STEM teaching and learning facility. And so opportunities arose for us to collaborate, and also for me to just think deeply about what is art. My research focuses on many things, but it's human dimensions and science intersecting. And one of the areas of research that I'm engaged in is understanding how people make decisions and then plan to behave or engage in actual behaviors around environmental concerns, including climate change. How do they perceive risk, et cetera? And so what I really liked about this is, while there's been some effort to activate that emotional center in people, because you have to activate it before people will take an action. What I thought was really great is I could look at these proposals, try to imagine what the artist was saying, and sort of feel in myself if that would invoke an emotion, good, bad, or otherwise, among people who were participating. And so for me, it was sort of fun in that way. The only other thing I did want to say, though, is as someone who is not trained at all in reading these artist statements, I was struck by how similar some of the artist statements were to the way some scientists talk, in that I don't understand what you're talking about. I didn't understand. Sometimes I don't understand what scientists are talking about because of the language that they use. And I felt the same way about some of these proposals. And what was interesting is, again, those were the proposals that weren't as capturing to the community as a whole. And I think science does the same thing. And I think that's a really interesting domain of exploration. Why do we use these languages to cloak what we do?
Yep.
Like great perspective and point too, because I think, like, in some ways I see the exhibition design and development as like collectively writing a story together too, and like the language you use matters, and kind of the descriptions you use matter. And so seeing kind of how we all parse through that and kind of made a vision for the exhibition is really cool to discuss.
So Caroline, this was your first time on a curatorial panel, and similar to Hadley, in some ways, you've been active as the director of education for the collaborators, but I'm curious what it was like for you to be sort of on the other side of a curatorial decision.
Yeah, I think, like, in some ways similar to Julie, like I felt familiar with it, but also a little out of my element, because typically I think how things have worked with our exhibitions is I usually come in a little bit later or a little bit after. And then my role is really, of course, like starting to interpret that for my team of students that are working in the gallery space, and starting to think about what are kind of the additional trainings, or what are the additional like narrative connections that we can explore. And so for me, selfishly and personally, thinking of my work stream, it was really interesting to kind of be in at the beginning, and to kind of talk a little bit about like, what is it we hope to accomplish with the exhibition, And then kind of having a little bit of a preview, or a detailed preview, I should say, to go into training. And I think what it's enabled me to do, and hopefully the collaborators experience this as well, is to really delve into the theme beyond the individual exhibits a lot more, and to kind of structure different conversations and dialogues around the theme as a whole. So I had a blast. It was super fun to go through and see everything from the very beginning. I've
Well,
always kind of, I think, lurked in the background of some of the open calls from more of a technical management perspective, but to actually go through and read them and think about some of the things that Abhishek and Julian Hadley mentioned was a really enriching experience for me.
also for our listeners, I don't know, I don't think we said this, but collaborators are young people that we get to be in the exhibition, and they're there anytime the exhibition is open. They're not traditional docents. They don't tell people don't touch things or give unsolicited historical information and so forth. They're actually there to help the public reflect on their experience and to engage them in dialogue, hence the term collaborators. And so we usually have a number of them in the exhibition to talk to the public. I think overall we have, what, 20 or 30 in a season, and they're phenomenal. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks.
May I ask, are they undergraduates? Who are these collaborators?
Yeah.
Are they from the community or?
Yeah, they're a mixture of undergraduate and graduate MSU students. So I would say it tends to lean a little bit more toward undergrad, but we've certainly had grad students and welcome grad students before too.
And we also have had, in the past seasons, we've had people from other institutions, not just Michigan State. And we have had some people from the community. So
yeah.
They have the opportunity to become part of it if they can. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky because it takes time. And if people are working, it's hard to integrate in their schedule. But in principle, we'd like to have a mix.
So, one of the things I think is really interesting about the exhibition development process too is we don't always decide the exact kind of sub themes that emerge, like going into the open call process. We kind of let the submissions shape what some of those sub themes are. So I'm wondering if you all can talk a little bit about some of the patterns that emerged as we made selections and narrowed it down from that large pool to about 16 exhibits. And whoever wants to go first can tackle this one.
I can take a shot. I think, well, maybe I'll talk one or two categories that I definitely saw that I think were unique and will be unique for people who come visit, but definitely the idea of restorative justice. You know, there are themes like, so obviously you talked about this, climate science tends to be all doom and gloom, but you know, what do we do now? You know, if this is a science, if these are the facts of the world, how do we move forward and how do we bring about the justice that's needed in some ways. I think those are definitely one theme that I saw, which again tends to be more sort of future oriented. So that's one pattern I found.
So another one that emerged that I've continued to find fascinating, I'm putting in the realm of sort of the role of technology, although it's not just technology, it's also social practice, but it also touches on something that some scientists call bioremediation, which a lot of people translate as nature finding ways to heal itself or to respond to its own difficulties and to correct them. And so, like, I was a little bit leery of technological magic bullets coming into the process, and finding proposals like, for instance, the one on urchin futures, which isn't just about raising urchins and the fact that urchins are heat resistant more than other aquatic creatures, but it's also about creating porcelain and tints for clothing and tints that are biologically friendly. So it was addressing technology, but it was also addressing people's relationship with nature and changing that relationship in a way that makes it more desirable. So I thought that was an interesting example of a kind of theme. And actually, I suppose it's actually two themes in a way. It's like, how do you change people's relationship to nature? Because there's a number of exhibits that reflect on that. And then also, what is the role of technology? Could it play a beneficial role in some cases?
Yeah. So there's a lot of really, really cool pieces. So this next question is a difficult one, but I'm wondering if there are particular individual exhibits within the show that each of you are most excited about. And maybe we'll start with Julie. Maybe we won't start with Julie and edit that part out. So let's start with Hadley.
So I think the piece that right away when I read about it, when it was submitted and was just super excited about was Loom and Gloom. I can't speak, but Loom and Gloom, with just how not only like looking at historically how like arts and crafts movements weren't really seen as like real forms of art, or actually like, yeah, like it was like this kind of just women's work. So having, or should I describe what Loom and Gloom is? Or
Go ahead.
What?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So Loom and Gloom is using plastic bags to and weaving them into, isn't it like their own bags or different
Tapestries.
Or tapestries, yeah. And so taking this thing that is historically this like women's work, arts and crafts work, and not only like presenting it in a art exhibition, but also like in a very sustainable way, discussing ways that we can use trash and things that take thousands upon thousands of years to break down, and how to repurpose those things. I think it was a very cool and kind of interactive way that hopefully people will be able to, at once leaving the exhibition, will look around and see things that they could always repurpose for something they might not have even thought of before.
Other favorites.
There are too many to choose from, but let's pick one for the sake of it. I think this one's is called Feeling Climate Crisis. They are these kinetic sculptures that are activated through climate science data. And this sort of hits on what Mark touched on very in the beginning, you know, what art can add to the conversation of climate change. And I think this does it really well. I'm very excited to see them in person. But it's a set of kinetic sculptures that are reacting to various data, such as temperature, ocean, acidity, things like that. And they're sort of activated and visualized through these sculptures that move. And I think it's sort of, and these sculptures themselves have, organic elements to them. So they're tree branches and stuff like that. And so I think the what it does, which is different from just a simple data visualization, you can see a graph and see how things are changing, but put it in a very different way or designed in this very specific way. I think it has this emotive response, and hopefully again gets us to this idea of why 1.5 is such an important number. And so I'm very excited to see this piece in person.
So I think for me that actually raises another issue that I alluded to earlier, and sort of an interesting thing happened with regard to process in this piece too. So originally it was going to be about mushrooms that eat the plastic and material like CDs, audio CDs. And as the researchers started working with the mushrooms, they found out it wasn't working the way they thought it was going to work, and they thought they were going to lose the whole exhibit. But one of the researchers discovered that the mushrooms were actually sending electrical signals to one another and found a way to hook those up to an analog synthesizer. So now the exhibit is about how mushrooms are communicating with each other as they're eating different kinds of substances, which brings a different oral component to the whole thing than what they thought initially. But it also is an interesting example where a failure leads to a discovery. And they didn't know that the mushrooms communicated, much less using sound and electricity and so forth. And they also didn't know how to turn that low-level electricity into sound. So they learned all kinds of things from this moment, which they thought was going to sort of be the canceling failure. And I just really, I think that's such an inspiring kind of scenario and narrative. And I think it's great to be able to present that in the exhibit. And I'm glad that we have the framework that allows us to do that. And we didn't have to say, oh, well, too bad, you know, try next time or whatever. So that's one of mine.
So great to Hadley's point about conversations and dialogues too, is it's, I think, a great conversation to be able to have with people that visit the gallery of, because that's the nature of kind of innovation, experimentation, both in the arts and the sciences, is sometimes things don't work out the way you thought they were going to, and being able to talk about that process, I think, is going to lead to some really interesting conversations.
Yep. I don't want to be a pig, but there is one other that I think is really distinctive, and it's part of not the exhibit proper, but the workshops that we put on. And one of our exhibitors has been doing workshops that address mental health issues among young people in relation to climate change. And I thought that was quite striking initially, but now the more I read about it and the more I hear people responding to that happening, I realize that this is a lot more important issue than I realized. And the fact that he's doing this workshop, I've come to think, is just extraordinary. So I'm delighted that we chose to encourage him to do that. And I think that, you know, Caroline has had the opportunity to work with him. He did a session for the youth festival that helped him sort of practice and tune his presentation. So I'm thinking that's going to be a really striking, extraordinary kind of component to the overall package too, which I can say a little bit more about at the end.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Mark. And I think, like, unintentionally in some ways, because when we still, I know that resonated with a lot of us when we were reviewing the open call too. And then actually in the design for the visual identity for 1.5 Celsius, like to me, one of the really compelling design elements in that is the incorporation of quotes from different students that submitted it. Around kind of what their reflections and reactions to climate change are. So, like, I don't think we intended that for the start, but I kind of love how that particular workshop and the conversation and dialogue that comes from that has kind of been worked into the exhibition design itself. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of the iteration and growth of those quotes as we go on.
I agree.
All right. So to close us out.
Can I just add one? I'm sorry to interrupt. So Mark brought up the workshops, and I was going, so when you asked which exhibit I'm most excited about, frankly, I don't know. I just like art, but I don't know that it does for me the same thing as it maybe does for y'all. I'm just excited to go and to see what it looks like. Fine. I'm really interested in those workshops because I don't quite envision what they will be, and I'm very excited to go to them, but also bring some youth that I know to them who are interested in science and interested in art, because it's not my world, but I think it could be their world. That's what I'm going to say.
Awesome.
All right. So to close us out, because I know we're almost at time, but what do each of you hope that visitors are going to take away from engaging with 1.5 Celsius? And I know we kind of touched on this in different ways. And Abhishek, maybe we'll start with you.
That's a good question. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the more I've sort of been in this field and, doing my own research, and then now obviously coming across so many amazing people in different fields, one thing to realize that it's a very complex issue. I think even the number, 1.5, it sort of is just this one number, but there's so much more behind it. And so I think to appreciate the complexity of it, the scale of it, one thing I'm very excited about having, exhibitions like this is like a large institution like MSU is able to host it. And I think the problems here are require institutional change, and then of course institutions are made up of people like us. And so we in turn have to sort of act as that change. And so for me, I hope people can think about what role that they play a part in this large web and see that, there's a little bit of agency all of us have, even if it's very little. And if collectively we can sort of come together, then we can have an institutional change across the board. And so for me, just having that sort of switch of perspective and feeling that even though despite of the potential existential crisis we're facing, there is still agency that we all have that we can collectively work together towards.
Hadley, what about you?
I think what I'm hoping people get out of it is that it's super scary, but hopefully going throughout the exhibition and having the conversation surrounding the pieces will create some hope and also create ideas on how people can have an impact on an individual level, and also how we can all work together to have an impact on a much larger level towards climate change.
Julie, what about you?
So I think for me, it has to do with the way in which we conceptualize boundaries between discourses. So that science is different from art, is different from community and lived experience. And I think what I would love for people to walk away with is that, oh my gosh, these aren't separate things. And actually, Hadley, you don't know this, but I find your pathway just super exciting. And I Abhishek, you too. Like, I talk about you two all the time because you've lived in this space where those things aren't separate. Science and art are not separate. And so what I want people to take away from is that these are not separate circles or even a Venn diagram, but in fact, they're all one thing. And I knocked my glasses off because that's how I roll. Keep that in the video.
Perfect.
Will do.
Mark.
So what I said in earlier on, like, what do we do and how do we get enough people to do it, are something I would like people to think about in the light of an incredible range of different perspectives and approaches. It's not just one thing that needs to be done, and it's not just one contribution that can be important. And one of the things that I think the exhibition as a whole demonstrates is that important things can come from lots of different directions, different disciplines, different ways of work, different walks of life, different stages of life, different kinds of communication can play an extremely important role. And like Abhishek said, this is complex, but so can the response be. And there's room for everybody to do something to counteract these pending catastrophes. And I think that also it's kind of heartening to know that there are people doing things and that you're not alone. You're not the only person trying to counteract these things. And there are other people who are going to work with you on that. And so I feel really delighted that the exhibit, without, I think, saying it's going to automatically happen, or without saying it's all bound to fail, we're all going to be extinct. I think it walks a very thin line, but it does walk a line that does suggest that there's still hope.
Thank you, Mark. So I want to thank all of you, of course, for joining us today and for sharing your time and expertise with us. I know I certainly enjoyed our conversation both today and then working with all of you and getting to know all of you throughout the curatorial process. I also want to give a shout out to MSU FCU for their support of this exhibition and for making this work possible. And of course, to those of you that are tuning into this conversation. If you want more information on 1.5 degrees Celsius, particularly about some of the fantastic programming that we mentioned that will also be happening throughout the fall and winter, please visit our website at museum.msu.edu. And take care, everyone.